Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are in the country. Welcome to FTA's presentation on how to prepare and submit the Recipient Information Request, the RIR. We know that probably around late November, possibly early or late October, early November, then you receive notice from FTA alerting you that you're being reviewed in calendar year 2022. And advising you that you have to respond to the RIR and provide certain information to your reviewer. Should have identified your reviewer in that letter as well. And so this webinar is basically designed to help you guys figure out what the RIR is asking and respond to it appropriately, hopefully give you a smooth review. Just a quick FYI, if you have not received notice with an RIR asking you to give an RIR response, reach out to your program manager at FTA. Because of COVID, then we kind of lost a year. So if you had your last review in 2019 and you're expecting to get reviewed in 2022, but you haven't received any notice about that, definitely reach out to your program manager at FTA just to kind of confirm the status of whether you're getting reviewed or not. So just some quick introductions here. My name is Matthew Bussey. I'm a senior associate at RLS and Associates. I'm joined today by my colleague, Greg Harnett, also a senior associate at RLS and Associates. Greg, do you want to say hi?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon.
Okay, great. And then we'll have Rich Garrity in the background curating questions and whatnot. Greg will explain a little bit more about that in a moment. So just one thing to emphasize, this is one of a series of webinars that FTA is putting on. We know that your responses to the RIR are probably due around January 21st. We know that there's some variation, but it's probably around that date. And so this week, we're going to be doing a series of these. Today's obviously is January 11th. We're going to be focusing on the civil rights topics. We're going to go into a little bit more detail than we do when we are time constrained and trying to address all the topics. We've got that luxury today, which will be nice. Then tomorrow, there will be a presentation on the non-civil rights topics. And then Thursday, January 13th, then there will be a webinar that is aimed at recipients who have operating expenses below 100 million, typically what you consider a tier 4 recipient, but we'll basically go through the whole presentation then, and that'll cover all 23 review areas as well as our tips and tricks on how to respond best to the RIR. So if you have a colleague that wasn't able to come today, or you just want to watch one of these again, then by all means, you're welcome to do that. So just you can forward this on to whoever. The links are both in the webinar here, which is both going to be uploaded into the chat box. It also, a link to this was provided to you in the reminder email that got sent out about an hour ago. So either look in the chat box and download it from there, or you can access that in the email that was sent to you at 1 o'clock Eastern time. So with that, Greg, do you want to go through the welcome?
Absolutely. Thanks, Matt.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, welcome everyone. I just want to go through a few administrative items before we really dig into the content of our presentation here. The first thing I want you to know is you can download both this presentation and the RIR template, which you should probably already have a copy of. And our colleague Nathan put that in the chat. It's a bit.ly link. In addition, if you didn't see it there, you probably noticed everyone signed up for this webinar about an hour ago, got an auto-generated email that said something like, remember you have a webinar in an hour. At the very end of that email, there is a link to both this presentation and the RIR template. So you have multiple ways to access those now. We're very thrilled to have such a large group with us. Because we have such a large audience, we do want to receive your questions, but we ask that you actually use the Q&A or the chat function in this Zoom webinar platform, and you type in your questions. And what we'll do, we have our colleague Rich Garrity, who's the Director of Compliance Initiatives here at RLS and Associates. He'll kind of in the background be answering questions, and then he'll also curate maybe common questions or questions that make a little bit more sense to talk out at the end of our presentation. So after we go through the material in this slide deck, we will have the opportunity to kind of in real time respond to some of those questions. And also you'll see that we actually have a number of polls throughout this presentation. We ask that when a poll does appear, please just participate. They're going to be very easy questions, no reason to overthink them. In fact, this is actually a very good segue. I think we have our first poll question right now, so let's get that up there. The initial question is just asking you how many triennial reviews you personally have previously participated in. Of course, we mean triennial reviews and state management reviews here. So we have 4 options. The first is if this is your first review, you'll select that. The second option, maybe you've been through 1 or 2 previous reviews. The third option, 3 or 4 prior reviews. And the last option, if you've been through 5 or more reviews, you're a true all-star and you'd click that. So I see results rolling in now. We'll give it just a few seconds to get a large enough sample size and I'll feed back. All right, perfect. And this is kind of what I expected. The number one response, 39% of those who answered said, this is my first review. So that's actually very good information for us to have as presenters here. We'll make sure we tailor this presentation to our audience here. And as you saw with Matt's slide just a few minutes ago, there are also at least 2 additional webinars that we're going to be delivering. So, you know, throughout your poll responses will help us further improve this presentation. And actually, it goes down almost in order. We had 29% say that they've had 1 or 2 previous triennial or state management reviews, only 15% saying 3 or 4, but we've got 17% who have been through 5 or more. So a nice split, but by far the most common is that this is your first triennial or state management review. Great, so let's move on. Okay, perfect. I just want to go through the purpose of today's webinar. So what we're doing today is we're focusing exclusively on the RIR, that stands for Recipient Information Request. Now, many of you might actually know the RIR by a slightly different name. Up until about, I think last year, it was called the GIR, which stood for Grantee Information Request. It's the same idea. It has changed a little over the years, but we're going to go through the RIR today. We're going to go through an overview of what specifically the RIR is asking recipients to upload. Now, today we're focusing just on the civil rights areas. So that means DBE, Disadvantaged Business Enterprise, ADA. There's actually 2 flavors of ADA. You'll see we have a chapter on ADA General and then Complementary Paratransit. And then, of course, EEO and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act as well. So we've got a number of topics. If you were tuning in today expecting to hear maybe non-civil rights areas, we're not going to go through that today, but tomorrow's webinar will focus exclusively on those non-civil rights topics. So just wanted to get that out of the way initially so you can determine if you're in the right place or not. The other thing we'll be doing, in addition to just kind of running through what the RIR is asking of recipients in terms of their responses and uploads, we're going to talk at the end of all that about tips and best practices that Matt and I as reviewers can kind of we can pass on to you, and I think that'll really help you in your preparation throughout this RIR process. And as Matt mentioned, if you are up for review in FY22, that means you probably had a review in FY18. Now, even though we call it the triennial review, we actually have a unique 4-year review window here, so we'll just keep that in mind as we go through this content. But many of you have probably already heard from your reviewing contractor, and that line of communication is open. If that's the case, we ask that if you have any specific compliance questions that are kind of outside the scope of this RIR submission, that you work with your reviewer and also your FTA regional office to get those questions answered. I mean, we would be happy to answer those now, but honestly, we don't want to step on anyone's toes here, and we want to preserve the process between kind of the communication flow between you and your reviewer right now, so we won't interject ourselves. We do ask that if you have specific compliance questions, you reach out to your reviewer and or your FTA regional office. Great, next slide, please. Okay, so I just want to give a quick overview of our triennial or state management review process. As you can see, there are 9 basic steps. Where we are right now, we're at RIR, Recipient Information Request. It's not the first step, but it's towards the beginning. So in a nutshell, the RIR is the step in the process where you as the recipient are asked to provide information about yourself, and that can take the form of several tables in the RIR that we'll go through. There are also a few narrative questions that need to be answered, but by far, I think most of the heavy lift in this RIR submission process stems from the various documents that you'll be asked to upload. So that'll again be the focus of our presentation today. You can see the next step after RAR says scoping ERM. If you've been through this process before, you might know that ERM stands for Enhanced Review Module. So basically, as you know, there's a deadline associated with your RAR submission. As Matt mentioned, that'll be January 21st for most of you. There is a little variation, so if you have a different date, you probably know that you're, you fall outside of that January 21st. But in general, it'll be due at the end of January. Now, the RAR is important. It obviously has a due date, but we want to make sure you know that the RAR isn't your last opportunity as an FTA recipient to communicate documents or information to your reviewer. That's really going to happen throughout this review process. But the reason there's a due date associated with the RAR is really mostly for the scoping process. So once your RAR submission is uploaded to your reviewing contractor, typically there's an FTP site that you'll use to upload it. Each reviewing contractor has a slightly different process, so they'll outline that for you if you don't already know about it. But once everything's uploaded, then the FTA region and your reviewing contractor will take a look at what you submitted. And if there are any areas where there's a heightened risk of non-compliance, then an ERM, an enhanced review module, might be appropriate. And again, the ERM is triggered by perhaps any gaps in documentation you provided, or if you provided outdated information, the ERM would kind of be a double click on that specific topical area during your actual site visit. So as we continue on, as you probably know, the site visits for FY22 will be virtual, so they won't be in-person site visits. They'll probably be conducted over a video conferencing platform, much like what you see right now. And the way the timeline goes is the scoping will probably happen in February. The earliest you might receive your virtual site visit will probably be in early March. And then that season will kind of extend through July. So there's kind of a long window in which you might be scheduled for your virtual site visit. And that might take perhaps a week or two during that kind of long window. The reason I bring all this up is I want to say if there is a particular month that works very well for you in terms of having your virtual site visit, or oppositely, if there's a time that just doesn't work because you have other commitments, I would communicate that as early as possible to your reviewer, just so that they can be sensitive to that as they are kind of compiling their schedule for reviews this season. So please just kind of along the theme of communicate with your reviewer, let them know of any preferences in terms of scheduling. A few other things I just want to talk about on this slide. As you probably know, at the end of the site visit, there is something called an exit conference. And really, that's the opportunity for the reviewer to give you a snapshot of what they saw in terms of any findings and corrective actions that might have to be taken. And really, from that point on, from the end of your virtual site visit, which will be the exit conference, all the remaining milestones are calculated really in terms of business days from that exit conference. So after your exit conference, you'll receive a draft version of your compliance report within 21 business days of the exit conference. And as a recipient, you should take a look at that draft report. And if there's anything in there that you feel perhaps has been miscategorized or just otherwise not stated accurately, that is your opportunity to kind of provide your comments and your input on the draft version of that report. And then what will happen is in the background, the FTA region and your reviewer will take a look at your feedback, and they'll make sure that where it's appropriate, it'll be folded into the finalized version of your compliance report, which you will receive within 45 business days of the exit conference. And then I just want to let you know, if you have any findings, you probably know if you've been through this process before, there's typically a corrective action period that goes along with that. And I want to make sure you know that the timeline doesn't really start ticking for you needing to take corrective actions until your organization receives its finalized compliance report, which again will be 45 business days after the exit conference. So that's just kind of a very high level overview of our review process. Just wanted to let you know where we are now and how that fits into the overall process. Great. So next I'll talk about section A of the RIR. This is called the recipient profile. This is the first part of the RIR document that you'll have to fill out. As you'll see, there are actually 5 tables here, and we'll have a slide that kind of looks in more detail at each one of these tables, with the exception of table 2. So table 2 is for states only. So we're not going to get to today. And actually, I should say Table 1 Operations Profile. If, I don't think we have many in the audience, but if you are part of a state DOT and you don't actually provide public transit service, you wouldn't fill out Table 1. Instead, you'd fill out Table 2. So that's how that works. Really what I want to draw your attention to on this slide before we jump into examples of those tables, the objectives of this recipient profile is basically it helps describe your agency. It provides your reviewer and the FTA region with a clear picture of your agency's size, what types of modes of public transit you operate, etc. And this is particularly important because, as I mentioned, the last time your organization was reviewed was likely in FY 2018. So quite a while ago, and then a lot has changed in that time period, specifically over the past 2 years within the context of this global health crisis. So really the recipient profile is your opportunity to provide an updated snapshot of the characteristics of your organization. And as you probably know, oops, if we could just go back to the last slide. Yeah, I just wanted to talk about how your review and recipient profile, that'll help your reviewer determine which areas will be applicable. As you probably know, there are some topics, there are 23 potential topics that could be applicable. Maybe not all of those will be covered in your review. So when you fill out this recipient profile, that'll kind of be the first step in the process where your reviewer and the FTA region kind of scope your review and determine which topics need to be covered. And we ask, as you can see, we have an RIR tip here. We ask that you complete this recipient profile as accurately as possible, and that'll really help you throughout this review process. If, for instance, perhaps you have a contractor or maybe it's a subrecipient, you're not really sure, you've been calling it one thing, but perhaps you don't know exactly what that relationship is, I would be honest in terms of disclosing that in your recipient profile of your RIR. And the reason is, you know, the sooner these issues are caught and the sooner you can begin working with your reviewer to get to the bottom of these things. These are potentially issues that could be cured before your exit conference. So if it's something that you kind of misrepresent, obviously that's bad, or something you're not sure of, but you don't indicate that you're not sure. If this issue isn't caught until perhaps the last minute, maybe during your virtual site visit, there might not be time in the background to cure that deficiency. So my tip is just kind of communicate early and often, get everything on your reviewer's radar. And this process will probably feel like more of a partnership maybe than it has in past review cycles, just because the virtual format, there's a little bit more, we'll call it FaceTime, I guess camera time, but there's some time in the background to potentially fix up some of those lower hanging compliance issues. So that's our first RIR tip there. Great, so here's an example of table 1. Remember I said there are 5 tables. You can see we've just populated this with dummy information, but we want you to know that the information you provide here in your operations profile, this should be current information at the time of your RIR submission. So if any of this information in the operations profile is perhaps different from what is contained in some of your written policies and procedures, that's probably a sign that this is the time to go back and update perhaps some of those policies and procedures so they reflect your organization's current operations. And as I said, this table is a snapshot, but we also ask that in addition to any subrecipients or contractors your organization might have right now, please identify any other subrecipients or contractors that you've had at other times during this review window. So perhaps if 2 years ago you had a contract with a service provider that concluded, you reprocured that contract and it went to a different firm, then you would kind of want to note the dates of each contractor just so your reviewer can put together that puzzle. And we also ask that in this operations profile, table 1, you include any contractors or lessees that are locally funded. As you probably know, FTA's triennial and state management reviews really focus in mostly on FTA funded assets. However, if there are any maybe locally funded contractors or lessees, that would probably be outside maybe the scope of our review, but that helps give your reviewer context and a more holistic perspective of your organization. So we do ask that in this profile, you include any locally funded contractors or lessees as well. So let's continue on. This is still table 1. It's just a little bit lower. You can see there's a spot where you have to identify the span of service by different modes. And we ask that you enter the information as you see it appear here. So a definite start and stop time of operation. What isn't as helpful is if you were to write something like, oh, on weekdays, we operate 12 hours of demand response. So without that start and stop time, it just isn't as descriptive as it could be. And then continuing on, you'll see here that there's a place in table 1 where you will list any facilities, transit facilities that you might have, and you would specifically identify those facilities that have any FTA interest, meaning the facility was constructed in whole or part with FTA monies, or it was substantially renovated with FTA money. So you can see the column there that says FTA interest, yes or no. Obviously, if you'd write yes, that means there is some FTA money in the facility. And even though we're not going to cover non-civil rights topics today, you can probably see where I'm going with this. If you do have an FTA funded facility, then that would have implications under the topic of maintenance. Specifically, you'd have to provide a written facility maintenance plan if there's any FTA interest there. So we ask that you fill out the chart just like this, and we'll continue on to the next table if that's okay. So remember, we skipped table 2, that was just for states. Table 3 really asks the same thing about any subrecipients you might have. So if you have 1 or more subrecipients, you would want to identify the subrecipient. You would want to list their facilities, especially their FTA funded facilities, indicate the source of FTA funding. So that might be, for instance, section 5307 or section 5339. And then year completed and location in terms of street address, I think are pretty self-explanatory. But as a general theme, and we'll probably see this echoed throughout today's presentation, if you do have any subrecipients of FTA monies, you essentially stand in your subrecipient's shoes when it comes to their compliance. And as you probably know, there's an oversight obligation if you have subrecipients. So that's why this table 3 is very important. Great. Table 4 is all about award activity. So as you can see, there are kind of 3 main buckets here. The first is going to ask you to provide a brief description of any noteworthy projects that your organization has completed since your last review. And then, as you can probably guess, the second item is about any notable projects that are currently ongoing. And the third thing you'll be listing is any noteworthy projects that your organization has planned over the next several years, 3 to 5 years. So I think one thing to keep in mind as you're filling out table 4, the award activity, if you've been through this review process before, you might remember that your compliance report is what we call an exceptions-based report. So it might list some compliance deficiencies, but we as authors of those reports don't really get the opportunity to talk about all the wonderful things we saw during the virtual site visit and just over the course of the review. However, you might know that a version of this award activity chart does appear in your compliance report. So this would be a great time or an opportunity for you to take credit for any completed projects that you're particularly proud of. And as I said, some of this will be a data point that feeds into the finalized report. So it would be a good opportunity to have in writing in your report kind of all those nice things that you've done. And another thing that's really helpful, especially when we're talking about noteworthy projects that your organization has planned over the next 3 to 5 years, be sure to note anything that will be novel or maybe different in terms of the scale or complexity that your organization is planning to undertake. What this will do is just kind of get that on the radar of your FTA region. So if perhaps you are undertaking a more novel project, you might need a little more support or guidance. That's a time where you can benefit from that relationship you have with FTA. They'll be able to put you on the right track. Great, and Matt, I'll pass it back to you for section B, if that sounds good.
Great, thank you, Greg. So the section B, second part of the RIR is the document upload. And this is where we actually go through the 23 review areas. Every year they seem to add a couple more. We're up to 23 now. So this is the section of the RIR where they go through the 23 review areas, and they actually ask you some questions and ask you to upload documents. Each of the 23 areas is designed pretty much the same. It starts out with just the basic requirement for whatever the section is. Here we've just got an example for the basic requirement for financial management and capacity. Then after the basic requirement, then there's a document table, and the document table has a couple things. First of all, it states the required documents that the reviewer and FTA are asking you to upload. Then it states the applicability of the particular document. So obviously not everything applies to everybody. You know, if they're asking if the required document is subrecipient oversight procedures, it's only going to be applicable to recipients that have subrecipients. And so that's where that is delineated. The next column is the date submitted column. And this is, it may seem a little bit silly, but it's actually a little bit handy for your reviewer. Just because if I'm looking through, you know, a mountain of documents or folders and folders of documents, and I come across something that I think should have been submitted, but I don't see it in your folder, I can go back to RIR and see on the date submitted, oh, okay, they said that they tried to submit it. So I'll reach out and make sure we get that, we're all on the same page. Next up is the electronic file name, and it's pretty self-explanatory, although we will go over a bit about that in a second. And then lastly, the last column is comments from the recipient. And we really advise that you use this column as liberally as possible. It's your opportunity to kind of explain anything that needs explanation. If, for example, you know, something doesn't apply, you don't have subrecipients, and so it's not applicable to you, then this would be the box where you can explain, we don't have subrecipients, so it's NA. Similarly, if there is a document that you don't submit, maybe you don't have a policy in writing or a procedure in writing, then you can state that and give your reviewer that information. Or lastly, also, if you've got a document that's being uploaded, it's being revised, say it's like a Title VI plan or something like that, that gets submitted every 3 years, submitted periodically, and you're in the process of superseding your current one with a new one. Well, your reviewer, you know, they're going to want to look at your most current documents. And so if that's the case, just say something along the lines of, you know, our new one's due in a couple months. We'll get it to you before the review. That way your reviewer is apprised of that. Then the third thing, and this is not in every one of the 23 sections, there are a couple of open-ended questions. For those of you who remember the grantee information request from way back when, you probably remember that that was mostly a narrative question-based document. It was asking you to actually write up answers for a slew of questions for each review area. The new, or not the new, it's been around for a few years now, but the recipient information request, as Greg alluded to earlier, is more of a document upload. So that's what the focus is. However, FTA does still have a few questions where they'd like a narrative response from you prior to the review. So that's what this is. As I mentioned with the document naming, the reviewer will really appreciate if you follow the this folder file naming convention. And don't worry, this is all included and spelled out at the beginning of your RIR, this what they'd like you to do here. Basically, we'd like you to label the folders as shown and the documents as shown. It'll really help the reviewer be able to look at a particular document, know exactly what it is, and know exactly what requirement it is responding to. So that'll go a long way. Then in addition, as Greg also mentioned a little while ago, your reviewer is going to collect these documents from you using probably an FTP site, a file transfer protocol site. And they'll give you instructions. They'll reach out to you and tell you exactly how to use whatever FTP site they're using. One thing that we highly recommend is that when you get that information from your reviewer, that you test out your credentials and make sure that everything works. You know, if the due date for your RIR response is, you know, January 21st, you don't want to find out that your credentials don't work at 11:59 p.m. on January 1st and not meet the deadline for your RIR submission. So test those out now, make sure that you and your reviewer are all on the same page as far as how documents should be uploaded and whatnot. And one thing to keep in mind is, so after the deadline for your RIR response, we recognize that, you know, there may be new documents that you add on, some of which may be in response to comments that your reviewer gives you. Sometimes it's, you know, again, you've got a policy that's being revised, those types of things. Reach out to your reviewer after the RIR response deadline. If you're going to add additional documents, reach out to your reviewer via email or phone. don't necessarily just add new documents to the FTP site. If the reviewer's FTP site is anything like ours, then if someone adds new documents, then we don't receive any type of notification or anything like that. So reach out to your reviewer by email or phone and just say, hey, do you want me to email these, or just FYI, I'm uploading a new thing to your FTP site, so just be aware of that. So that keeps everybody apprised of what's going on. We mentioned earlier that there are 23 comprehensive review areas. Today's session is obviously going to be focusing on civil rights. So we've got disadvantaged business enterprise, we've got Title VI, we have ADA, which again is broken up into two sections now, general and complementary paratransit, and then we have equal employment opportunity. So we can go ahead and jump into these review areas, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to talk about what the RAR requests. And then because we have the luxury of time today, then we're actually going to also mention some of the items that are frequent follow-up items that your reviewer is going to ask for in the course of doing the review that aren't mentioned in the RAR. And so it'll be a little bit more in depth than what you get in the global presentation that covers all 23 areas. We've got a little bit more time today, so we thought we could do that for you. So starting with disadvantaged business enterprise, DBE, the first requested document is your most recent DBE program if it's not uploaded to TRAMS. And I would say a couple things here. First of all, this is a good opportunity. You've got at least a few months before your review actually happens. I would dust off your DBE program. I would go in there and make sure that it was reflective of your current situation, particularly who the DBLO is, the DBE liaison officer. If that is not current, then I would definitely make it current and submit that to TRAMS in your RCRO. The DB program obviously is, unlike a lot of the civil rights documents that have to be submitted periodically, the DB program doesn't. It's a static document. You only have to upload a new version when there have been significant changes. But if your DBLO is not accurate, if that's not current, then you definitely want to submit that, update and submit that. Another thing that I'll point out here is as far as the DB program, also your DB goal, your Title VI plan, your EEO program, any of your civil rights documents that you submit to the RCRO for concurrence, I would check prior to your review and just go back, dig up those concur letters and see perhaps if they had any comments or revisions that were requested. One thing that we see a lot of the times, which is kind of a low-hanging fruit finding that's easy to avoid, you may get a concur letter on your DB program or DB goal or whatnot, and you may get it and see the concur and be all happy and just put that in a drawer and think you're good to go. But at the end of the concur letter, then sometimes there are comments from the RCRO, the Regional Civil Rights Officer, that basically say, so we're concurring with your program or your goal or whatever it is, contingent on you making these additional changes. And those changes are going to be reviewed at your next at FTA's next review opportunity, which in this case is your triennial review or your state management review. So I would first of all, advise that make sure your DB program is up to date, and also make sure that your DB program, as well as all of your other civil rights documents, make sure that they were concurred with, and if they were concurred with, that any changes that were required, they're being concurred contingent on those changes being made, that you have in fact done that prior to your review. That'll keep you from getting surprised when the reviewer is conducting the virtual review. The next thing that's requested in DBE is a current organizational chart, which includes the DBLO, again, DBE liaison officer. The chart should illustrate that the DBLO has direct and independent access to the CEO. Basically what this means is they don't have to go through channels or anything like that if they need to talk to the CEO about DBE matters. Then for item C here, the DBLO job description, what we're talking about here is the actual job description for the person who holds the DBLO position. Hopefully in the job description, then it includes DB responsibilities. It says some of the things they're going to be doing as the DBLO. So that's what they're looking for in item C. Then for item D here, documentation of implementation of small business element measures. So you may remember that in 2012, the DB regs were revised so that you were supposed to incorporate a small business element into your DB program. an element that was basically how your organization is going to foster small business participation. And so what your reviewer is looking for, they're going to, first of all, when they're reviewing your DBE program, is that small business element present? Did you actually update the DBE program as you were required to way back when? The second thing that they're going to look for is documentation of implementation of your small business element measures. So whatever you said in your program, are you actually doing it? If you're making an effort, you're say that you're going to make an effort to break up contracts so that not just major companies, but perhaps small business as well can bid on certain portions of the contract. If you said you're going to do that in your DB program, can you provide evidence that that's something you've done during this review period? Which I think Greg mentioned earlier, just emphasize, we basically added an extra year, or we didn't, FTA added an extra year to your review period. We obviously had COVID, we lost a year. And so this review period is going to basically start on the day after your last exit conference, and it is going to continue through the date of your virtual review. And so it's a little bit longer than usual. So just keep that in mind when you're uploading documents, or when you're responding to requests for, what you're supposed to upload. Remember that it's basically that 4-year period that started on the day after your last exit conference. Item E here, shortfall analysis and corrective action plan, if not required to be submitted to FTA. So obviously under DBE, you have your 3-year goal that you submit every 3 years by August 1st. Whatever that goal happens to be, your triennial goal, it applies for each fiscal year. And so each fiscal year, then you are supposed to meet that DBE goal, that triennial DBE goal. It can be a little confusing, but it's done on an annual basis. So if in 2020 you had a 3.2% DBE goal and you only got 2.8% that year, then in that case you have a shortfall. And so you'd have to perform a shortfall analysis and a corrective action plan. A shortfall analysis is basically saying, we didn't meet our goal. This is how much we under-attained. This is why, and this is what we're going to do about it so we can meet it in the future. Certain agencies, the top 50 agencies, as determined by funding from FTA, are actually required to submit their shortfall analyses. They have to, by December 29th in the calendar year, after the fiscal year in which they missed their goal, then they actually have to submit that to their RCRO for review. If you're not one of the top 50 agencies by funding, then you still have to create a shortfall analysis, but what you do is you retain it, and then your reviewer is going to take a look at it at the next reviewing opportunity, which again is your triennial review, or your SMR, your state management review. So definitely, I would recommend that you go back, look at your uniform reports for the entirety of this review period, see what your actual DB attainment was, make sure that there weren't any shortfalls that were due for any particular years during this review period, because this is, again, something that is an easy one for reviewers to pick out, and it's a relatively easy one for you to avoid a finding on. So go back, make sure that everything was copacetic, you met your goal for each year, and if you did not, that you did a shortfall analysis. Then here in item F, your reviewer is going to want to see a list of any DBEs that were terminated or substituted on a project. So if you ever had a prime contractor that was using DBEs on a project and they tried to terminate or substitute them, you can only do that in certain situations. They have to show good cause, they have to get prior written consent from you, and there are a slew of kind of process stages that have to be followed in order to do that. And so provide a list of any situations where a prime contractor tried to terminate or substitute a DBE, and your reviewer is going to look and make sure that all the required aspects were followed. So that concludes the documents that are actually requested in the RAR itself. As we mentioned earlier, one thing that we're going to do during this presentation is also talk about the recipient follow-up. This is a screenshot directly from the contractors manual. If you don't have the contractors manual, it's pretty hot off the presses. The fiscal year 2022 contractors manual is available on the FTA website. So go take a look at that. And in each section of the contractors manual, then not only will it show you all the questions that are going to be asked, how the reviewer is going to look at what you provide, what the indicators of compliance are, kind of the subsets of the questions. I'll show you the governing directive, in other words, the legal source of what the requirement is, so you know your reviewer is not just making it up, all those good types of things. But one of the other things that it includes is this recipient follow-up, which are things that the reviewer is instructed to, if applicable, follow up and request from you after you've already done the recipient information request. So we'll just go through this kind of quickly. The first thing is information demonstrating that the recipient does not meet the threshold for DBE program submission. This probably doesn't apply to any of you. To meet the DBE threshold and be subject to DBE, you just have to have 250,000 in federal contracting opportunities in a given year. And so almost all of you, I would imagine, meet that threshold, have to have a DBE program. And so there'd be nothing to provide here. The next bullet is information that demonstrates when and on what projects the DBLO and CEO have direct and independent communications about the DBE program. So we talked earlier, you have to, the DBLO has to have that direct and independent access to the CEO. This is basically saying, provide us any evidence you have to show that, the DBLO did actually reach out and talk to the CEO about DBE matters. Sorry, I can't speak today. And so anything you can provide along those lines will be helpful for your reviewer. Next up is documentation of notification to FTA of transit vehicle awards, so TVM notifications. Basically, if you procured transit vehicles during the course of the review period, then you are supposed to notify FTA of that award within 30 days. And there's like a SurveyMonkey website that you go to report those. This might be something that your procurement department does. It's often something that is kept in the procurement files, but you want to make sure that you reported any of those transit vehicles that you procured, who it was and what the amount was, and that you either took a screenshot or you printed out that SurveyMonkey page, because once you press that submit button, it just vanishes into the ether. Your RCRO can fortunately dig it up, but it's not something that you would have handy. And so make sure that all those transit vehicle awards have been reported, and make sure that you have that documentation to show that you did it. Next up, this is really not applicable probably to any of you, but documentation supporting the recipient's assessment that no DB goal submission was necessary. Again, that's very unlikely to apply. Next, written procedures for compiling and preparing the uniform report on DB awards, commitments, and payments. These are your uniform reports that you submit semi-annually. So if you have procedures in place that are written on, who's going to do what, when you're going to do it, how you're going to ensure their accuracy, how you're going to ensure that they're submitted timely, all those types of things, then provide those to your reviewer. It'll just help them get an understanding, get context on what your processes are with regard to this. And then the follow-up item is backup documentation for compiling and preparing the uniform reports. So, if you're working with your procurement department so that they're notifying you of all their contracting opportunities. And if you have subrecipients, then you've got ways of collecting their contracting opportunity information so you can take their DB attainment and include that. Any documentation you have as far as what your processes are, again, with the actual preparation of those uniform reports. Missing reports that may not have been uploaded to TRAMS. Obviously, all of your reports should be uploaded to TRAMS. Occasionally, technical glitches happen, whatever. So if your reviewer is looking at your uniform reports, which is something they're going to do, they're going to TRAMS and they're going to make sure they're all there, and they're going to make sure that they're all submitted by the 6/1 and 12/1 deadlines, respectively. If anything is missing, your reviewer will reach out and say, hey, do you have this? For whatever reason, it's not in TRAMS. So that's a potential follow-up. The next bullet, evidence of reduced use of contract goals if DB contract goals are used and the overall agency DB attainment exceeds overall agency goals. What this is basically saying is if you're using contract goals, in other words, race conscious goals, and you are exceeding your agency DB goal, and you do that twice in a year, or I'm sorry, 2 years in a row, then at that point, then you are supposed to be like, oh, we're exceeding our goal, but we're doing it via contract goals, which are not race neutral, and you're supposed to attain your goal to the extent feasible through race neutral means. So if you're using contract goals and you exceed your goal for 2 years, then you're supposed to reduce your reliance on contract goals. So any evidence you have of those types of things, provide that to your reviewer. Next, document implementation of race neutral measures. Like we said, it's supposed to be a narrowly tailored program to remedy the effects of discrimination, DBE is. And so you're supposed to the extent feasible, meet your goal through race neutral measures, just show anything that you're doing, whether that's, outreach or meetings or whatever it happens to be, provide that to your reviewer. Next is written certifications and monitoring, including on-site monitoring for sample contract files. This is just to show that you're making sure that DBEs are actually doing what they're doing, that they're serving a commercially useful function. And so if a prime contractor is saying that they're using DBEs, that you visited the site, that you've made sure that that's actually happening in practice, that they're being promptly paid as per the prompt payment clause in the contract, all those types of things. And one quick note here, obviously right now we're in a pandemic, we're in COVID. And so maybe in 2018 or 2019, then it was something where you do CUF reviews, commercially useful function reviews, you do those in person, you'd actually make the site visit. Obviously FTA is aware there's a pandemic, your reviewer is aware that there's a pandemic. They're going to be understanding that you may not be doing those in person anymore. Just describe what your process is now as opposed to what it used to be. FTA is always very curious about how agencies have adapted to the hardships and challenges that COVID brought. Finally, we just have certification files. If you are a certifying agency and you're actually certifying DBEs, then provide certification files so that your reviewer can take a look and make sure all the requirements were followed, using the right forms and everything's timely and whatnot. And then for your staff who certify, who actually perform the certification, make sure that they've taken that 9-course module from the National Highway Institute. So if you have records of that when they attended, they get a certificate, whatever, provide that if you're a certifying agency. So I know that's a lot. It was a lot more than just what was in the RER, but since we had time today, then we did want to give you kind of the extra little walkthrough of the potential follow-up items that aren't included in the RER, just so that there are no surprises in this process. So with that, I will turn it back to Greg for Title VI.
Thanks, Matt. So Title VI, as you probably know, is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So landmark civil rights legislation. We obviously just call it Title VI. For item A, the RAR is asking for your most recent Title VI program if it's not already uploaded to TRAM. So 2 things I want to say about this. I know Matt, I think, mentioned both of them, but it's worth rehashing. So your Title VI program, as you likely know, has a shelf life of 3 years. So every 3 years, it has to be updated and reapproved. Now, it might be the case that your Title VI program that you currently have now, and at the time of your RAR submission, between the time of the submission and your virtual site visit, maybe you have an update due. If that is the case, as Matt mentioned, please make use of that column in the RAR that's for recipient comments and note that, hey, we're providing our current Title VI program. We're in the process of updating it. We're aware of the deadline, and we will provide you with the updated document at the time of review. The second thing I want to mention about the Title VI program, similar to the EEO program that Matt was describing, you should receive a concurrence letter from your RCRO, the Regional Civil Rights Officer. And it's a similar format, like Matt said. You want to make sure you scroll all the way to the end of it because there might be specific things that the RCRO is asking you to fix and address in your Title VI program. And as Matt mentioned, the timing for doing that is what FTA calls it the next oversight opportunity, which would be your triennial or state management review. So check that concurrence letter. If there are any requested revisions, you want to make sure you make those. All right, moving on. For item B, the RAR is asking for a listing of Title VI investigations, complaints, and lawsuits that have occurred since your last Title VI program submission. And the reason we're asking for all this stuff since your last recent Title VI program is, as you probably know, this listing is a required element that has to be in your Title VI program. So we probably have it there. We're just interested in anything that happened after that. Moving on to item C, the RAR is asking for a list of language assistance training for staff. Now, again, this is something that would be addressed in your Title VI program, specifically in the LAP Language Assistance Program. And there are a few similar acronyms here. We've got LAP and then LEP, which stands for Limited English Proficient Language Groups. So what you want to do is make sure that you're providing your reviewer with a corresponding list of kind of training material and efforts that tools and other resources that you're using to ensure that limited English proficient language groups have access to information and services about your transit program. Moving on to item D, the RIR is asking for specific examples of public participation activities that, again, have been performed since the last review and, again, have to align with your Title VI program. So these would be efforts that your organization specifically made to enhance minority and limited English proficient populations and involve them in public participation activities. And one thing I'll say specifically about item C and D here in regards to Title VI is your Title VI program, basically your reviewer will seek to confirm the implementation of what you've listed in your Title VI program. So I guess another way of saying this is you don't want to overpromise in your Title VI program. So if you're doing things and you're not actually doing them in actuality, that's setting you up for failure. So you want to make sure your day-to-day practices match what you've promised to do in your Title VI program. Great, let's go to the next slide. Thanks, Matt. So continuing on in item E, the RIR is asking for a list of transit facilities that you've cited since your last review and copies of the corresponding equity analyses. So as you probably know, if you are citing any new construction, there's a Title VI implication there. And as you probably know, again, the three protected classes under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act are race, color, and national origin. So essentially, you want to make sure you're selecting a site for any FTA funded facility that does not have the effect or doesn't cause a disparate impact on any one of those protected groups, again, race, color, or national origin. So if you've cited a new facility, you should have a corresponding facility equity analysis that goes through that process. Moving on, item F, the RIR is asking for a list of transit facilities to be constructed or leased in the upcoming 3 or so years, and then copies of the corresponding equity analyses. So really, item F is very similar to item E. We're just kind of looking forward now, and that's what you would want to communicate to your reviewer. Moving on to item G. Oh, Matt, go ahead.
I just had one comment. I just want to make sure everyone's aware that the requirement that you do an equity analysis for transit facilities, siting, or construction, that applies whether you are below or above the Title VI threshold. So certain things, like as Greg will talk about in a second, equity analyses for fare changes, major service changes, those are only required if you're above that threshold. In other words, 50 peak vehicles in a UZA of 200,000 or more. That is, whether you're below that or above that, you still have to do the transit facility siting or construction equity analysis. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear.
Absolutely.
Sorry to step on your toes, Greg.
No, that was great. And perfect transition. We're going to talk about that threshold right now. So as Matt said, if you have 50 or more vehicles in peak service and you're located in an urbanized area that has more than 200,000 in population, there are going to be additional Title VI requirements that apply to you. So if you have met those thresholds, as you probably know, you're going to want to provide in item G with your RIR submission a list of any fare changes or major service changes since your last Title VI program submission. You're also going to want to include the dates of those changes and brief descriptions. And one thing I'll point out is you might see a very similar requirement under the chapter section 5307 requirements that is actually very different from this in a way. It's a completely separate requirement. It reads similarly, but instead of obviously under Title VI, we're asking for any fare changes or major service changes. The section 5307 requirement that looks a lot like this is actually narrower in scope directionally because it's only asking for any fare increases or major service reductions. And then with regard to that threshold that Matt was describing, that section 5307 requirement will extend to anyone who gets that type of funding. So there's no threshold there. Just wanted to bring that up because they're two similar things, but they are very separate and there are differences in scope and applicability. Great, so continuing on, in item H, the RIR, this is a little duplicative, but they're asking for any service equity or fare equity analysis conducted since the last time you submitted your Title VI program. Again, because anything you've previously conducted up to the point of the Title VI program submission should be in the program itself. So we don't need to see that. We just want anything after that. Great. Moving on to item I, and I want to draw a little attention to this one. So the RIR is asking for any service or fair equity analysis conducted, again, since your last Title VI program submission, but this is specific to fixed guideway service, new starts, or small start projects. And the reason is you actually have to complete these equity analyses 6 months prior to the planned start of any of these projects, so new starts or small starts. So if you are in that situation, please note that, and that's what item I is asking for. Moving on to item J, the RIR is asking for a competitive selection or annual program of projects process. Now, this is applicable just to state DOTs, but the general spirit of this requirement is that in your planning process, you should consider the needs of minority populations within your service area. Moving on to item K, the RIR is asking for a list of all subrecipient applications that you've received during the review period. This is applicable just to states and MPOs who are direct recipients of FTA money. So in this list, you'd want to identify subrecipients that were accepted and rejected. You'd also want to call out any applicants that are minority organizations or they serve minority or low income areas, and of course, the amount of funding. Great. So that's actually what the RIR is asking for. Again, we're just going to give you a little preview. This can be found in the Contractors Manual, FY22. The version of that is now up on FTA's website. And actually, for many of you who were last reviewed in FY 2018, you probably know the Contractors Manual by a slightly different name. It used to be called the Comprehensive Review Guide. So it's updated every year to reflect the most recent FTA guidance. It's called the Contractors Manual now. You might, again, know it as the Comprehensive Review Guide. But as you can see here, there are a number of follow-ups after your RIR submission that your reviewer may ask for either leading up to or during the virtual review process. Now, a number of these, you can kind of glean that they might ask for these based on what we've covered in the RIR. So it is somewhat duplicative, but I'm just going to point out some highlights here so that you're aware of this. And again, this is a direct screenshot from FTA's FY22 Contractors Manual. And actually, you know what? I'm going to leave it at that. I don't think I'll break these down one by one. I think a lot of this was kind of covered in what I just said. So if it's okay, Matt, we can go on to the next slide.
Sure.
All right, great. So next up, I'm going to talk about Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. Like I mentioned at the start of this presentation, there are actually 2 chapters on this topic. So the first is just kind of general ADA, and then the second chapter is applicable only to those FTA recipients that operate complementary paratransit. But there is a little bit of play between the 2 chapters, and we'll kind of point that out as we work through this material. So first up, item A, the RIR is asking for your ADA complaint procedures. As you probably know, this is most commonly found on an FTA recipient's website. So you might just want to drop in the actual link to your website and of course, make sure the link isn't dead and it works. But one thing I want to highlight about the ADA complaint procedures, it should be clear to someone viewing your website that these procedures are applicable to all service, including fixed routes. So we're not just talking about ADA complementary paratransit. This is ADA related complaints that could stem from any of your public transportation services. And similarly, in item B, the RIR is asking for your ADA complaint form. So you might not have a form, it might be kind of built into your website. So again, a website citation would be acceptable here for your RIR response. But the form must specifically mention ADA. So it can't be kind of a general customer service portal or something like that. It specifically has to say ADA. And actually kind of building on that, you might know that Title VI has a similar complaint process. It can actually look a lot like the ADA complaint process. So some agencies have actually combined their ADA and Title VI complaint forms into one kind of overall discrimination form. That's okay, and you can do that. Sometimes that'll streamline things, but again, you want to make sure that that discrimination form, again, specifically says ADA, and if it extends to Title VI too, you're going to want to say Title VI, and typically there's a series of check boxes in the complaint forms, and a lot of the best practice examples out there will show this. It'll say something like the experience or the discrimination I experienced was based on the following, and it might say race, color, national origin. It would have to do that if you're using it for Title VI. Again, those are the 3 protected classes under Title VI. And then also maybe a checkbox for accessibility or disability. So it also extends to ADA.
And if you're doing that, Greg, then it's important to be cognizant. If the complaint form is checked Title VI, race, color, national origin, you have to follow the complaint procedures that are outlined in your Title VI program or your Title VI plan. If the box is checked as disability, then obviously you'd be following your ADA complaint procedures. So you differentiate on the form what's the source of the discrimination, and then you follow whatever your process is, which they may be similar, they may be different.
Absolutely. And maybe one additional thing I can offer about that complaint form is if I didn't have this job, I probably wouldn't really know what Title VI is. And I think a lot of people who actually use the transportation service might be in a similar boat. So they might not necessarily say, "Good sir, I have a Title VI complaint." They just know that they've been discriminated against. So you don't have to use any word or check a specific box. In fact, if you get an ADA or Title VI complaint just through maybe your general customer service portal, you're going to want to make sure you have a process where behind the scenes, whoever receives those complaints can perhaps make a determination, even though they didn't say Title VI or ADA. This looks a lot like potentially discrimination based on disability, or perhaps discrimination based on race, color, or national origin. So just another thing to think about. And with that, we'll move on to item C. The RIR is asking for ADA complaint record retention procedures. Just as some quick review, the standard is that you'll save all of your ADA complaints for at least 1 year. And then for 5 years after the complaint, you'll want to have just kind of a record. It could be maybe an Excel sheet that kind of has the relevant details of, how the complaint went, if there was any ultimate decision made or action taken. You'd want a summary of all that, but the actual ADA complaint itself, you'll save that for 1 year. The summary will go back 5 years. Moving on to item D, the RIR is asking for any driver handbooks, operating and training manuals, or ADA related service bulletins. And really what this is you'll upload any training materials that you use for onboarding new drivers, or maybe refresher trainings, and your reviewer will just seek to determine that that training material is consistent with all the current ADA provision of service regulations. Item E is actually kind of related to that. So the RIR is asking for here sample internal service provision monitoring material. So that could be like a survey, a checklist, an interview form. So maybe your organization has some kind of program where there's a ride along, or maybe even a mystery rider program where someone is kind of evaluating an operator's adherence to ADA regulations. So if you have any kind of monitoring like that in place, you would want to, again, upload that with your RIR response. Great, let's continue on to the next slide. Okay, in item F, the RIR is asking for your ADA reasonable modifications procedures. And again, you can provide this as a link to your website, but as you probably know, basically your obligation under the ADA as an FTA recipient is you have to advertise the availability of any reasonable modifications and policies or procedures where necessary to perhaps avoid discrimination on the basis of disability. So you want to make sure that's advertised and you have a process in place behind that. Great, moving on to item G, the RIR asks for rider's guides, including paratransit guides. So like I said, paratransit is kind of the next chapter we'll cover, still under ADA, but the reason I'm bringing that in now is because often we see a lot of the ADA content that we would be looking for as reviewers kind of in the paratransit guide, and perhaps not in just kind of the general service manual. So we do ask that if you have any kind of paratransit guides, you'll upload those with ADA general in addition to under ADA complementary paratransit. Now, work with your reviewer. They might have a slightly different preference, but that's usually how I would want to see it. And as you can see here in our guidance, we say sometimes there's some coverage of compliance topics like service animal, wheelchair, especially that standard wheelchair language, which we don't use anymore. We would sometimes only see that in the paratransit guides and not the general kind of ADA or rider's guides. So we want to make sure we're capturing that. Moving on to that. Oh, go ahead.
I've got one more, Greg. To that point, yeah, the final rule on reasonable modification in 2015 eliminated the term common wheelchairs, which is something sometimes we still come across in rider's guides or training materials and whatnot. It's real low-hanging fruit avoid that and go through all of your materials and make sure that there's no reference to a common wheelchair anywhere in any of your materials. It's just an easy one to keep in mind.
Absolutely. Great. So we'll pick it up at item H. The RAR would ask for any new facilities that you've constructed or altered since the last review. And really the reason behind this is if you have a new facility, it should be built to comply with ADA regulations, or if you have renovated an existing facility. With very narrow exceptions, you also have to make sure that that renovation brings it up to code in terms of ADA compliance. Moving on to the next item, I, current certification of equivalent service and supporting analysis. So this is really two things. And in general, I expect this to perhaps be less applicable, certainly than it was in past review cycles, because this is only for demand response service providers that have acquired inaccessible vehicles since the last review. It's really hard these days, as you might know, well, first of all, just to acquire any vehicle, but there's not really a market now for transit vehicles that are not ADA compliant. So, this probably wouldn't come into play. However, if you do not have a homogeneous vehicle fleet with regards to accessibility, then you have the obligation to go through a level of analysis and make sure you're providing equivalent service to members of the general population and the accessibility community. And if you look through the Contractors Manual, you'll see that equivalent service has to be based on a number of elements. So there's that analysis of making sure the service is equivalent. And then as an additional step, if you don't have a 100% accessible fleet, you would then have to file with FTA a certification that you are in fact providing equivalent service. Great. So everything we see on this slide now, you won't find in your RAR, but we just want to maybe give you a preview. A lot of this stuff will eventually come into play during your review. So wanted to make sure I highlighted this. And the basic idea here is that any service provided under contract or any similar arrangement actually has to adhere to those same ADA requirements that would apply to your organization as the recipient. So again, kind of another variation of that theme that if you have subrecipients or contractors in this case, you would stand in their shoes in terms of their compliance here. So if you contract for service, your reviewer will very likely ask for those contracts. They would want to make sure that you have some kind of oversight process in place to make sure that, again, anyone providing service under contract is doing it in accordance with the ADA regulations. And we can see here, if you look at item L, that this includes to TNCs, transportation network companies, also perhaps taxi companies. So these would be, in some cases, private entities. So I wanted to highlight that. And before we move on, Matt, is there anything else you'd like to add regarding this slide in particular?
No, Greg, I think you covered it well.
Okay, great. Just wanted to make sure because this was a later addition. Okay, let's continue on then. Okay, and then here again is just a screenshot from the FTA FY22 Contractors Manual. It just shows that there are items under ADA that your reviewer will ask for in addition to what you've provided with your RAR. A few things I want to point out here, where we see documentation of structural impracticability, or practicality, excuse me. Really what that means, that's the narrow exception I described. If you renovated one of your facilities and you did not bring it up to code in terms of complying with ADA standards, there are narrow exceptions where, as you can see, it was impractical due to the structure, or it was disproportionate to actually bring it up to speed. So there are some narrow exceptions that are kind of outlined here. I think a lot of the other stuff you can see, you can kind of tell where it came from based on what I just went over. Great, so we'll go on to the next slide. So here's our next chapter. We're still talking about ADA, but now specifically complementary paratransit. So we see with item A, the RAR is again asking for your paratransit rider's guide. Like I said, you may have also provided this under the ADA general section. Moving on to item B, the paratransit application form. So this is what someone would want to fill out if they sought your complimentary paratransit service. Moving on to item C, operations, dispatch, scheduling, or reservation procedures. So really what this is we want to make sure that, for instance, if you're scheduling a trip, you're able to provide it within that 1 hour before and after window. Otherwise, it would be recorded as a missed trip. We want to make sure you're doing all of those things as they should be. So that's why we'd like to see the operations dispatch and scheduling reservation procedures in writing if you have them.
It would be recorded as a trip denial.
Trip denial.
Yeah.
Did I say missed trip?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
Thanks,
right.
Matt. And hopefully everyone out there knows what I meant. Item D, the RIR is asking for sample notification letter templates for conditional eligibility, temporary eligibility, and denials. So basically, whenever you give someone less than unconditional access to complimentary paratransit, it's required that you say in writing the reasons why they were given less than full eligibility. So if it was conditional or temporary, or it was just denied outright, you would probably have templates that would describe and articulate those reasons. And also you would want to provide that rider with the opportunity to appeal that decision. So that's what item D is asking for. Item E is asking for your definitions of trip denials, missed trips, on-time performance, and excessively long trips, along with the related data for the past year. So basically, your reviewer will seek to determine that you're using appropriate definitions for all these things, and they'll take a look at your data to confirm that you have no capacity constraints when it comes to this type of service. Moving on to item E, I realize we have E here twice, but as you can see, the second E at the bottom of this slide has an asterisk because this is also something in addition to what the RIR asked for, but I thought we'd bring it up now because this is actually a fairly common issue that I've seen through my own experience and just anecdotally talking to other reviewers. So a no-show policy, basically what that is, most people call it a no-show policy, but what we're really talking about is you can have a policy that temporarily suspends service to riders that have demonstrated or shown a pattern or practice of missing scheduled trips or late cancellations. So it's not something you have to have, but if you do have a no-show policy like this in place, there are certain requirements that need to be reflected. And again, it's all laid out very clearly in the contractor's manual. So one thing specifically I want to bring your attention to, because I see this a good deal of the time, the standard that you use to determine whether a rider has kind of reached that pattern or practice of missing scheduled trips shouldn't just be an absolute number, like if someone misses more than 4 trips over a 30-day period. It actually has to be expressed, and it's not, it doesn't roll off the tongue, but it should also have a percentage included too that kind of reflects the overall number of trips and then compares that to the number of missed trips. So definitely, if you're a little confused on this, take a look in the contractor's manual. It's all very well laid out there, but a good portion of the time when I see these no-show policies, they aren't quite there. So if you do have one, make sure it is consistent with what is laid out in the contractor's manual. Great, we'll go to the next slide. Okay, great. So item F, the RIR is asking for ADA complementary paratransit service contracts. So this is very similar to what I said under ADA general. Any service provided under contract or any similar arrangement, it has to adhere to the same ADA requirements that would apply to your organization as the recipient. And then related to that, item G, you can see you would want to demonstrate that you're exercising some kind of oversight to ensure that's actually happening. Great, continuing on. Item H, the RIR, this is going to sound a little duplicative, so actually I won't go item for item here, but again, this is kind of asking for copies of contracts and oversight tools, so we can't stress that enough. Make sure if you're providing complimentary paratransit or any type of service under contract, know that that service has to adhere to ADA regulations, and you have an obligation as the FTA recipient to ensure that either through oversight or if it's a contractor, maybe a combination of oversight and have that addressed in your contract. Okay, great. And now we can see this is again a screenshot from the contractor's manual. There aren't too many follow-up items that your reviewer would ask for after your RIR submission, but we can see one of them is the no-show policy. So that's why I wanted to specifically call that out and recognize that that has traditionally been a more problematic area. So please take a look at that if you do have one of those no-show policies in place. All right, great, Matt. And I'll turn it back to you for EEO.
Okay. Thank you, Greg. Before we get started on EO, I do want to say one thing. I just want to mention that obviously this session and the rest of the sessions this week are geared towards helping you respond to the RAR. I do want to note that your contractor, whoever's performing your review in your region, will be conducting in-depth reviews of or workshops on the substantive aspects of the requirements and the required sections in the contractors manual. So, you know, this is basically a little 2-hour program on how to respond to the RAR, but your contractor is going to be holding those workshops either in late January or early February. And those will be going, you know, question by question, subject by subject through the contractor's manual, and we'll have a lot more substance about each section. So I just want to make sure that got said so that you guys keep your ears to the ground, wait, hopefully get those email notifications soon and be able to be aware that those are things that you can sign up for. So moving on to equal employment opportunity, the first thing that's required or that's requested by the RAR is just a head count, the number of recipient employees that are working on your FTA funded program. And a couple things here, we're including both full-time employees and part-time employees. And when we talk about employees, we're talking about transit-related employees. So anybody who is touching transit really in any way at your organization. And that could be, you know, people who are in maintenance, people who are in administration, people who are in operations, people who are in dispatch, all the way up to the CEO. It includes everybody who's touching the actual transit program. And the reason this is important is because it determines the applicability of EO. EO is applicable if you receive $1 million or more in a fiscal year for either federal fiscal year, either for operating or for capital, or if you request to receive $250,000 in planning in a federal fiscal year. And there's an additional threshold, and the threshold is the number of transit-related employees you have. So if you have 50 or more transit-related employees and you meet one of those prongs for the finances, then you're required to have what's called an abbreviated EEO program. If you have 100 or more transit-related employees and you meet one of the prongs of the financial threshold, then you have to have a full program. So that's why we want the head count. So make sure that you're current on that, providing accurate numbers to your reviewer, and so on. So for item C here, sample documents used for internal and external dissemination of the EEO program. What this is really talking about is, you know, posters in the break room, or, you know, having the EEO statement and maybe the employee handbook, or having for external dissemination, having any job postings or any postings that recruiters use for you, or that are putting out there for you, that those say that you're an EEO employer, equal employment opportunity employer. So those are examples of internal and external dissemination that you'd want to provide to your reviewers so that they know that you're doing all that. Next thing you'd want to do is provide the organizational chart that identifies your EEO officer. EEO officer should be an executive, and they must have direct access to the CEO. So make sure that that is evident from the organizational chart. Then for item E, designated employee and EEO officer job descriptions. Again, we would just want to make sure that in the person's job description, whoever is performing the role of EEO, that in their job description, then it outlines their EEO responsibilities. Like, you know, are they concurring with, you know, decisions in the hiring process, firing process, those types of things? Are they, you know, doing assessments and utilization analyses? All those different types of things. So hopefully that is in their job description. And then obviously supporting staff who are supporting the EEO officer would have various things like that in their job descriptions as well. And one thing to point out here too is that the EEO officer in all these communications, like the ones I talked about in the internal and external dissemination, you want to make sure that the EEO officer is identified by name, not by title. So it's John Doe at such and such contact information. It's not the EEO officer, EEO coordinator, or anything like that. For item F here, provide the standard performance evaluation for managers and supervisors. Item G, provide the employment practices chart I'm not going to go into details on that, but you can see that we've got a circular reference that lists all the things that are supposed to be in there. For item H, the EO complaint logs. So provide those, and this should be all complaints that are made to the EO officer in your organization. It should also include any external complaints or lawsuits, litigation. So if somebody's filed a administrative complaint with the EOC or filed a lawsuit, then definitely include those things as well. Also, you'd be wanting to, if there was anything like that, you'd be wanting to most likely notify your FTA regional counsel or the FTA chief counsel under the legal section, just to make sure that they're apprised of everything that was going on. Under I, provide agendas, sign-in sheets for meetings conducted when the EO policy and its implementation are explained. So if you have recipient or subrecipients or anything like that, and you're working with them to educate them on the EO program, then make sure that anything you've got as far as the PowerPoint, the agendas, the sign-in sheets, anything like that that you can provide is provided to the reviewer. Similarly, agendas and sign-in sheets for EO trainings or meetings with management. The EO officer has to meet with the CEO at least semi-annually. So anything you can show that you can provide to show that and document that. In addition, anybody who is promoted to a supervisory position has to be trained on EO matters within 90 days of that promotion. So any training or sign-in sheets or whatnot that you can provide to that effect as well. Item K, provide a list of EO training topics. Item L, list of newly hired supervisors and managers who attended the EO supervisory training that I just mentioned. M, a sample of recruitment entities and ads for job positions. N, a log of recruitment locations and recruitment dates for the review period. And O, a list of internal and external dissemination of the EO program for each year since last EO plan update. So obviously, much like Title VI, the EO plan is going to include this as an element of the EO plan. So the EO plan is submitted every 4 years, due on March 1st. It's going to contain as an element of it all of your internal and external dissemination activities. And so your reviewer is looking for any of those types of activities that have occurred since your last EO submission. And I guess one thing to just clarify is that, sorry, nope, yeah, never mind, I'll just move on that. Provide a list of meetings with affinity groups since last EO plan update, and a list of subrecipients and or contractors that meet the threshold to develop an EO program. So if you have a subrecipient or you have a contractor and they have 50 or more transit-related employees or 100 or more transit-related employees, then you would want to collect their EO programs, make sure that you're evaluating them for adequacy and sufficiency. If there are any things identified, then obviously you'd want to point that out to them and have them do a corrective action and obviously become compliant. So if you have subrecipients or contractors that meet the various thresholds, then you have oversight responsibilities and you'd want to be doing that. And this is another one where the contractors manual doesn't have a ton of recipient follow-up. It's just basically that documentation of review and oversight of EO plans for subrecipients where EO is actually applicable. So that's it as far as the substance of the sections that we're going to be going over. But we do have some RIR tips that hopefully will prove helpful for you. Greg, do you want to start off with some of these?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll take the first few.
Thanks.
So hopefully this will put things in perspective, especially if perhaps you're a little nervous after we've gone through all the things that you might have to upload. I would recommend, as you're completing your RIR document and gathering up those requested documents, also have open in front of you or on your screen the FTA FY22 Contractors Manual, because essentially the Triennial review and the state management review can be thought of as an open book test. And really the textbook is the Contractors Manual. So this will help you if you can crosswalk what for each section, what the RIR is asking for, and then also look at the questions that your reviewer may ask you. That'll help you understand what the reviewers are looking for and why, and hopefully make it easier for you to provide exactly what they're looking for. So when you're filling out a section of the RIR, we think you should consult the corresponding section of the Contractors Manual. And as we kind of described a little bit, that contractor's manual is set up so after each question, it'll have kind of instructions for the reviewer, which might be beneficial for you to look at, but it'll also have what they call indicators of compliance, which for many of these overall questions, it kind of breaks them down into sub-questions that speak specifically to an individual compliance topic or issue. So take a look at those indicators of compliance. And then of course, the recipient follow-up, we've been showing you screenshots throughout this presentation, but we just want to again, kind of impart to you that this RIR process isn't the end of what you will be providing your reviewer. It's really just kind of one milestone. And then additionally, throughout the process, your reviewer may be asking for follow-up documentations, perhaps updated versions of documents if you've been able to perhaps remedy a potential finding. So really that process will last all the way up to and including your site visit. And really kind of the point which you can no longer provide anything else to your reviewer is the exit conference at the end of your virtual site visit. Great, so we can move to the next slide. Some more RIR tips, and I think we've mentioned this a few times. So in many of the charts, there is a comments from recipients column in the RIR, and we ask that you please make use of that. Indicate things like, for example, when I said the Title VI program, if at the time of your RIR submission, you have a current one, but between the RIR submission deadline and your actual review, a couple months might go by and you might, during that period, have to reapprove and update your Title VI program. That's exactly the type of thing you would want to note in that comments from recipients column. Or alternatively, if you're perhaps unsure of something you uploaded, like I would call that out. It probably won't count against you, especially because we're so early now in this review process. It'll just help you and your reviewer kind of narrow in on any gaps in compliance. And again, because of this virtual review process, you might have the opportunity to kind of iterate on some of these responses and uploads and perhaps proactively address some potential findings. But there's a lot of variation between FTA regions and some review teams. So I can't promise that approach to everyone, but that does seem to be the general game plan here. And then as you can see, and I've mentioned this a few times, in a number of cases, it would be appropriate for you to just kind of put in website links instead of uploading documents like when we're asking for your ADA related complaint form and process. A website link would probably be most appropriate there. Great. So I'll take this slide as well. Again, try to be as accurate as possible when you're answering questions. And I know this is a little outside civil rights, but we see specifically when we're talking about assets or facilities that have a federal interest. Remember in the opening part of this presentation, we were going through the listing of facilities and you would want to identify those facilities that have FTA interest. You'd want to do the exact same thing for your subrecipients. So please keep that in mind, be as accurate as possible. And then something else I kind of hit on a little bit earlier. Many of us, many of you on the call probably have contractors or subrecipients. Maybe you have both, but sometimes the definition can be a little nebulous. And we've all kind of been in situations where you might call a subrecipient a contractor or vice versa. It actually doesn't matter what you call them. The relationship is actually just kind of based on the characteristics of, the relationship there. So I just want to share a little bit of language from 2 CFR 200. And as you might know, that's OMB's Uniform Administrative Guidance. A lot of people also call it the Super Circular. That's not the official name. It's just kind of the cool name. And people say that they call it the Super Circular because 2 CFR 200 applies not just to FTA grant recipients, but to any grant recipient of a federal grant award. So very broad in its applicability, but it is kind of the foundation from which a lot of our requirements stem. So with all of that out of the way, 2 CFR 200 says that subrecipients are non-federal entities that receive subawards from pass-through entities to carry out part of a federal program. So that's just one definition of a subrecipient. How I would compare that to a contractor is typically a contractor is selected as the result of a competitive procurement process. So that's probably the most obvious sign of distinction, but there are others. So please, if you have a contractor or a subrecipient, just take another look at that relationship and reconfirm that it is what you're actually calling it. Great, and I can pass it back to you, Matt, for these next few.
Okay, great. Thank you, Greg. So a couple more RIR tips. If you upload a document, please indicate where in the document the relevant piece of information can be found. So if we're looking for, what your securement policy is or something like that, and you've got a 50-page ADA policies and procedures, then if you can just indicate, hey, it's on page 42, that's definitely helpful. If possible, try and upload searchable documents. And I'll just say, first of all, it's really helpful for your reviewer, especially in long documents, to be able to search for various items that they're looking to confirm are in there. I'll say another thing, though, and that's that if your reviewer sees what looks to be a very old document, something that was written on a typewriter, and scanned in and isn't searchable, it can be kind of a red flag that they should take a closer look. If you've got a 20-year-old ADA training manual, and we know again that in 2015 they prohibited the use of the term common wheelchair. If I see what looks to be a really old training manual, then I might think to myself, well, I'm going to give this some pretty close attention because I want to make sure that they didn't accidentally use, or they didn't use that term and not update it when they were supposed to. So just something to keep in mind. In addition, if you don't have a written policy or procedure to attach for something, explain what the policy or procedure is in practice. And if a requested document does not apply, explain why. For files that are used to satisfy multiple requested documents, kind of similarly to, just generally speaking, if it's a really long document, if it's being used to satisfy multiple requested documents, just indicate where in the file the information can be found. And if no document is uploaded or no web link provided, then please indicate why in the comments. Last page of RIR tips, I think here. Make sure your documents are dated. This is really helpful for reviewers so that if they're looking at 3 different Title VI policies, then they know which one is the current one that they're supposed to be taking a look at. Sometimes the documents and trams are a little bit outdated and you've done something more recently. If for whatever reason, then the reviewer can't tell which one's newer, then they'll look to the dates and that'll help them out. If a requested document is in the process of being revised, indicate that in the RIR comments and just provide it when it's ready. And if you, after the RIR submission, have updated documents or new documents, submit them to your reviewer. And I think I mentioned this earlier, keep your reviewer informed about any changes or additions to what is submitted. Again, your reviewer probably doesn't get a notification or anything from the FTP site if you just add documents. So either reach out by email or phone and say, do you want me to just email this to you? Or if it's a really big document, let them know, hey, I'm adding this to the FTP site. So just know that there is an additional document or a supplanted document. Oh. One last one, make sure your documents are readable, avoid proprietary formats. Your reviewers are not tech wizards for the most part, they're just ordinary people. And so try and use standard Office formats like Word, Excel, PDF, etc. And to the extent possible, try not to lock or protect documents that would disable the ability to search or bookmark or highlight. Your reviewer is probably going to be doing a lot of searching and a lot of highlighting in anticipation and preparation for your review.